After a succession of tall people, you've got me. I'd like to begin my reflections this morning with a story that I found on the UUA website, talking about the immigration crisis that we're facing today. It's the story of Liliana, a young woman whose parents emigrated from Mexico to Oxnard, California while she was still in high school. Liliana stayed behind with relatives so she could graduate before following her family north. When the time came, her parents petitioned U.S. immigration to allow her to join them, only to be told there would be a 10-year wait on the application. Liliana, being 18, did something foolish. She bought a fake birth certificate and tried to cross the border with it. She was caught and sent back. So she went to Plan C, sneaking across the border to finally join her parents. In the years that followed, Liliana married an American citizen, had 2 kids, held down a job, and paid taxes. While she was pregnant with her 3rd child, her husband persuaded her to try to apply again for citizenship. After all, her parents, husband, and kids were already citizens. The process went well until the final meeting, when the immigration officer noticed her first attempt to enter the country. Misrepresenting herself as a U.S. citizen is a felony, and it disqualified her from applying for U.S. immigrant status forever. Not only that, she would have to leave the country immediately. 3 months later, she was nursing her baby at 6 a.m. when Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers burst into the house and seized her in order to deport her. After some negotiation, she was given 5 days to say goodbye to her husband, children, and parents to go back to Mexico alone. It should be noted that there are 4 million children in the U.S. who have at least one undocumented parent. And these young citizens live under the threat of being orphaned by ICE at a moment's notice. Current immigration law only allows the parents to stay if removing them would be a cruel, unusual, or extreme hardship for the child. Apparently, having your parents taken away forever at a moment's notice and being forced to grow up without them is not considered an extreme hardship by our government. We're not saying that what these immigrants did wasn't illegal, an immigrant activist said. We're saying that the response is excessive. It's cruel and unusual punishment. As UUA President Peter Morales noted in the holiday message that was just read, the theme of journeys is central to the Christmas story. Even if we suspend judgment as to the historical accuracy of the accounts of Jesus' birth in the Gospels of Luke and Matthew, as with many parts of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, they seek to convey a larger truth, both to their contemporaries and to later generations. In Luke's Gospel account, we find Joseph and a very pregnant Mary traveling to Bethlehem to participate in a census. Now, while there's no historical evidence of such a census, it provides a literary device for Luke to have Jesus born in Bethlehem, the city of King David, which in turn forms basis for the later claim that Jesus was the Messiah who was to be of the house and lineage of David. Matthew's Christmas story, as we can see reading it, is much different from Luke's. Gone are the angels, the shepherds, and the manger. Instead, we have the wise men from the east who follow a star to Bethlehem to worship this new king. Unfortunately, they speak first with the current king, Herod, who was understandably surprised to hear of a new king of the Jews. Not being one to brook challenges to his rule, Herod asked the wise men to tell them where they can find the infant king so that he, Herod, can worship him. The wise men, however, are told in a dream that Herod has other designs on the child to kill him, and so they do not report to Herod, but rather head back to their home in the east. Meanwhile, Joseph has a dream, telling him of Herod's intention, and flees with Mary and the infant Jesus to Egypt. Why Egypt, you might ask? If you look at a map of the Middle East, it's quite a distance from Bethlehem to Egypt. So why go there? Well, scholars have suggested that Matthew is the most Jewish of the Gospels. In looking at the significance of Jesus for Jews, the most apt individual to whom to compare Jesus is Moses. And where did Moses make his mark? Egypt and the Promised Land. Just like Luke, Matthew uses this birth narrative to support his thesis that Jesus is the Messiah and deliverer of the Jewish people. Most contemporary biblical scholars believe that the birth narratives in both Matthew and Luke were later additions to earlier oral traditions, as reflected in Mark, to make the particular Gospels points about the significance of Jesus to the readers of the Gospel. So that's what these stories meant to the people in their time. And that's part of contemporary biblical scholarship on which much of our Unitarian Universalist faith has been based. But what significance do these stories have today? In this Christmas season, how are we to understand these tales of Mary and Joseph and Jesus? While we are not first century Christians trying to understand Jesus in the context of the Jewish tradition, we confront some of the issues posed by the current refugee crisis, as well as the 12 million undocumented immigrants living among us. While we as Unitarian Universalists do not see our religious and spiritual duties exclusively through a Judeo-Christian lens, among our sources of the living tradition are Jewish and Christian teachings which call on us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. Concern for the stranger or the sojourner are common themes in both Hebrew and Christian scriptures. Here are a few examples, though these are the ones you don't see on the bumper stickers and the billboards and at football games. Exodus 22:21, you shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. When a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt, and I am the Lord your God. That's from Leviticus. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. From Matthew 25. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Hebrews 13:2. Thus says the Lord, do justice and righteousness, and deliver from the land of the oppressor him who has been robbed. And do no wrong or violence to the resident alien, the fatherless, and the widow, nor shed innocent blood in his place. Note that all of these passages, and many more, refer to caring for the stranger. Not just our loved ones, not just members of our community, not just those who can financially or economically benefit us. In probably Jesus' most famous parable, the Good Samaritan, the person who helps the stranger who is injured by the robbery is the Samaritan, an other in first century Palestinian society. It was this Samaritan, rather than members of the political and religious elite, who cared for the injured man side by side of the road and pays for his care by the innkeeper. Now, while I've referred to passages from the Christian and Hebrew scriptures, our Unitarian Universalist history and tradition impose the same expectations of caring for the strangers. In the past, we've talked about Reverend Theodore Parker from Boston, who was active in the abolition movement, running an underground railroad station out of his home and church, and in fact keeping a pistol in his desk to protect the fleeing slaves. Mary Livermore was instrumental in the activities of the U.S. Sanitary Commission that provided care to wounded soldiers during the Civil War. As was just noted, in the 20th century, Witzel and Martha Sharp worked in war-torn Nazi Europe to help Jews escape the Holocaust. And more recently, UUA President Peter Morales and many of my seminary colleagues and other Unitarian Universalists confronted Phoenix Sheriff Joe Arpaio protesting his brutal tactics against undocumented immigrants. Unitarian Universalists have been strong advocates for marriage equality in face of the opposition from many levels of government. And given the results of the recent elections, I feel we will find many more opportunities in the next few years to stand up for the rights and concerns of the others of our society. We must anticipate then that rather than a rational and comprehensive immigration reform of the kind that could benefit Liliana, there will be an emphasis on border security that will divide families and destroy lives. We must anticipate policies that will seek to roll back the rights of LGBTQ people and return insecurity to their families. We must anticipate policies that will further shred the social and economic safety net and benefit the wealthy rather than feeding, housing, and clothing the least of these. And since the election, there has been, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, a noticeable increase in hate crimes and acts by the so-called alt-right movement of neo-Nazis, Ku Klux Klanners, and their fellow travelers against immigrants, Jews, and Muslims. We can only speculate who will be called upon to support and protect next. What can we as Unitarian Universalists and as a movement and as individual Unitarian Universalists do in the face of these challenges? In the last few weeks, members and friends of Open Circle have begun organizing a Social Justice Now committee to address some of these challenges and provide opportunities for service. I invite you to keep an eye on your newsletter and email for opportunities that will arise in the next few months. As a congregation, we have supported the work of the UUA and the Service Committee in their promotion of peace and justice, which includes our generous gifts to the Gift at Your Table campaign. And we can be involved in our local politics and justice organizing right here in our own wider community to encourage policies and programs that will help us create the beloved community here in central Wisconsin. During the early part of the 20th century, one of the great voices for justice was the International Workers of the World, a fairly radical labor union that were known sometimes as the Wobblies. One of the most famous of their members was a union organizer named Joe Hill, who was convicted of what many saw as trumped-up murder charges, and he was hanged. He was the subject of a famous union organizing song that included this verse. And standing there as big as life and smiling with his eyes, Joe says what they forgot to kill went on to organize. Went on to organize. This time of the year, many celebrate the birth of a baby who grew up to be a young man who was the symbol of a new kingdom of justice for the least of these. Unfortunately, he was killed for his efforts too. Yet the tradition tells us that he began his life as a stranger, journeying from place to place to escape a cruel and murderous tyrant. Whether this story is literally true or not, it serves as a model for us to consider in the work that we do as people of faith. And so I'd like to conclude these remarks with the words that we used to open this service today by the Reverend Howard Thurman. When the song of the angels is stilled, when the star in the sky is gone, when the kings and princes are home, when the shepherds are back with their flocks, the work of Christmas begins. To find the lost, to heal the broken, to feed the hungry, to release the prisoner, to rebuild the nations, to bring peace among the people, and to make music in the heart. So may it be, and blessings.